If you are a writer or any kind of artist, this may be a familiar story. Do you remember when, as a kid, you were outside on a field trip, maybe even in a literal field, let's say, on a day-long journey with teachers and students, outside of the usual rhythms of school life and recess and the lunchroom and familiar spaces, and you found yourself straying from the topics and the tasks at hand. And you made discoveries and connections, wandering off with your own imagination. And you were excited with your discoveries in those moments in a new space, and maybe you held them up proudly, saying, "Did you ever notice that this looks like this? The shapes on this leaf look like the cracks in this puddle of ice, look like the veins on the back of my hand, look like the pattern on the back of her sweater." Or maybe a little less poetic, "Hey, this rock looks like a dog poop." Connecting the dots between things. And maybe you thought it, and maybe you had the impulse to say it out loud. And if you said it, you may have been encouraged. You may have delighted and amused those around you, or you may have been discouraged. And you may have been told calmly, "This is not the time for that. Today isn't looking for patterns day. Today is science day. This is the time for collecting data, the time for filling in your worksheet. This is the time to get back in line and answer the correct questions." But your urge was to connect the dots, because that's what interested you. And maybe you saw the lights go on in the eyes of the friend in front of you as you shared your discovery, and you took a kind of pride in this. Or maybe you made a new friend. Maybe somebody grabbed your arm and squeezed it and gave you the nod. And if you were sent to the back of the line and told to shape up, this may have been the moment where you decided that being an artist was an embarrassing pain in the ass and not worth the trouble. And this may have been when you decided you were going to be an astronaut, up there where you could eat delicious powdered ice cream all day and be alone. But the impulse to connect the dots and to share what you've connected, this urge is what makes you an artist and a writer. And the formats are infinite. Fiction, fantasy, poetry, blogging, tweeting. It doesn't matter. If you're using words to connect the dots, you're a writer. So Picasso said something along the lines that every child is an artist, and the problem is how to remain an artist once you grow up. So we're mostly probably grown up. Kind of. And now the question is, who decides? I think when we were young, when we envisioned our future selves as artists, we pictured ourselves somehow being hauled or hauling ourselves over that mythical fence where we'd leave behind the ranks of amateurs and hacks and other wannabes, and we'd bask in the glow of the arrival on the other side, where those waiting titles start to sound almost erotic. Published. And for the musician, signed. Legitimate, recognized as authentic, to be introduced at a grown-up cocktail party by a famous artist twice your age as the real deal. And that double-lidded wink and the hand gesture is important. So who does that? Where does it come from? Or maybe who used to do it and who does it now? And maybe does it have to come from above, or can it come from each other? Because in the wise words of Bob Dylan, more or less, shit is changing. And it's changing fast. And it's changing at the speed of the internet. I remember the time I first realized that my blog was a place for quote-unquote real writing, and not just some semi-artistic, smart-sounding rendering of what was happening with my band and in my touring life. And it was November 2005. The Dresden Dolls were off tour, recording some music somewhere at home in Boston. And I went for a walk in the public garden, 2 blocks from here, reflecting on everything that was going on around me, with a song by Casey Dynell in my headphones. And I saw something unusual, bobbing there in the murky waters of the Swanboat Pond, surrounded by dying fall vegetation. There was an empty green bottle of Miracle Grow. And I thought this was the saddest and most hilariously poetic thing I had ever seen. So the dots started to connect, and if I hadn't had a blog, it may have been a song. And if I hadn't learned piano, it may have been a poem that I wrote in my journal. The format doesn't matter. I went home, I wrote a blog that was sort of a poem and sort of not, and I remember reading back what I'd written and thinking, this is kind of writing. This is kind of art. And with the dots connected, I posted it. I shared what I had with a very small blog readership, and the heads nodded in the distance at what I wrote. And that's all I needed. It never occurred to me to try to publish anything I'd written, because as far as I was concerned, I just published it. And back then, the chances that anyone would read my little dot connection blog, poem, or whatever you want to call it, other than my small fan base, were slim to none. And hyper speed linking content barely existed. Twitter and Facebook and Tumblr weren't rampant yet. I was just reaching ahead of me in line into a distant field to my school friends, saying, look, did you ever notice that this looks like this? And my friends on the internet nodded and they smiled. So the title of this conference is Muse in the Marketplace, and while I was thinking to myself about this speech, another image struck me that I thought would be useful. And it's the image of the garret in the attic. And I've thought about it before when asked about the music business, but never really spoken about it. The garret belongs to that set of romantic notions that we had or we have about painters and writers and musicians and how they work. Up there, with a pen or a paintbrush or a piano, by candlelight, alone, drunk, chain smoking, agonizing, creating, up in the garret, and separate. Down to the ground floor and out the front door, you have the marketplace, which is loud. The stalls of exchange and the sound of bargaining and bartering and changing cash registers, and it's crass and mundane. Literally mundane compared to the garret. It is of and on the earth. I give you goats, you give me bread. I give you a handful of coins, you give me a paperback. I give you an Amex, you give me a Best Buy gift card. This is not artistic. This is commerce. But the building that supports the garret, let's call it the machine between, the middleman, the translator between the art maker and the marketplace, is collapsing. It's changing into a level digital playing field where anyone can pretty much share anything with anyone else. And artists are now empowered to distribute their work themselves, their writing, their music, infinitely and at their own will, without presses, without record manufacturing. It goes from your lips and your pen to the reader's ears and eyes via their internet connection. But in order to do that and to share directly, you have to leave the garret and go down to the bustling marketplace where you have to deal with people. And dealing with people sucks. So in this age of the independent social artist, which is kind of what this age is becoming, the question keeps echoing everywhere I go, which is, what about Elliott Smith? What about PJ Harvey? What about the shy or introverted artists who have no desire to leave the garret and enter the marketplace? And that's also a lot of writers. It is sort of, right now, the Wild West down there in the marketplace of the internet, and carrying your fragile, newborn artwork wrapped in a blanket through the stalls can be agonizing. The marketplace is dangerous, and it's dirty and loud and filled with disease and pickpockets and naysayers and critics. It's easier not to do it. But there is another option, which is to yell from your window. Call to your friends below, your comrades in art and metaphor, and invite them to a private party in your garret. And this is basically the essence of crowdfunding. So finding your people, your listeners, your readers, and making art for and with them, and not for the masses, not for the marketplace, not for the critics, but for your hopefully ever-widening circle of friends. And it doesn't mean that you become protected or safe from criticism. The minute you lean out that window and try to find your friends, you might get hit with a rock. And if you look down, you'll see a lot of this from down there. But you just have to learn to ignore that. And you'll see people quietly heading to your door and knocking. Let them in and tell them to bring their friends up. And if it's possible, provide wine. If you're not social, and a lot of writers are not social, you'll have a harder time doing this. Connection always comes with risk. Art and commerce have never, ever been easy bedfellows, and the problems inherent in mashing together expression and money don't go away. They just change. And nowadays, the biggest middle fingers from down there are the ones that scream to the artists who are trying to get help and funding. Could you just stop self-promoting? It's shameless. And no artist wants to hear this. You are a shameless self-promoter are the words that we fear when we think twice about giving our work to anybody, asking them to read it and asking them to help us. And the fear of being a shameless self-promoter, you can never really shake it off. But the problems of our age, because we can connect directly, are just these. This is it. The doors and the windows are open due to the internet having come along as a tool, and you can choose how to use it. And you will find an audience if your work is good and you put it out there. But with every wonderful connection you make online, there's more potential for criticism. And criticism on the internet can be nasty. It's not censored. And for every bridge you build together with your community of readers, there's a new set of trolls who squat underneath it. So I asked my Twitter feed last night at about 1 o'clock if there were any writers out there, and it being a late Friday night, there were thousands ready and waiting. And I asked the question, what makes you feel like an actual writer? Was there a moment when you started to feel like an actual writer? Answer any way you want. And I got hundreds of responses, and I looked for themes. And some people said when I first got paid, when I first got actually published, when I got my first review. But the biggest theme that I saw was people saying, when somebody told me that my writing moved them. And that was the moment for most people. It wasn't some legitimate wand that came and tapped them on the shoulder. It was the connection with another human being. And some of these people were blog writers, some were famous book writers, and all different styles. Format doesn't matter. What mattered is they'd moved another person. Nobody said they felt authenticated when they got their first negative blog comment or bad review. Well, there was one girl who said her boyfriend had told her that she was a fake writer because she wasn't writing at all, so she quit her job, which had a happy ending. We don't know what happened to her. We'll have to ask. A few weeks ago, we experienced an unbelievable tragedy when the marathon bombing happened, and it was terrifying for everyone around me. And I spent the day in Porter Square Books tweeting, talking with people near and far about what was happening, what to do, how we were feeling, how we were coping as a group. And 3 mornings later, I woke up in Cambridge to catch a train to New York, and I turned on the radio, and I was told to stay in my house. I hate being told what to do. So we left anyway. And on the drive to New York, I listened to the news with Neil, my husband, for 4 straight hours. And I cried a lot. I spent a strange and surreal weekend in New York. And then came home to Boston the following Monday morning with a head full of tragic news reports, mashed up with a hard set of personal decisions that I had to make. And the haunting idea floating in my brain of a 19-year-old who, having inflicted terrible pain on a lot of people and having watched his brother die and holding the enormity of his actions of the last few days in his own head, was hiding in the bottom of a boat. And I cannot deny that I didn't wonder how that felt. And I cannot deny that I didn't wonder how it also felt to be running 1 minute or peacefully watching the marathon and to be legless the next. Because that's what I do. I wonder. And I try to connect the dots. And I can only connect the dots that I can imagine. So back home that day, right before leaving for lunch with some friends, in that same bookstore, I wrote a 10-minute stream of consciousness, poem, blog, whatever you want to call it, about those connections and about that wondering over a cup of coffee. Showed it to Neil, who said, "That's pretty good." Posted it, and went off to lunch, thinking nothing more of it. And I checked in a few hours later, and my readers had read it, and I got some nice comments, heads nodding in the garret. But by the end of the day, I had been called a terrorist lover, and soon I was getting death threats by email into my website for posting a blog in which I dared to wonder how another human being felt. And the general theme of the criticism was, how dare you? How dare you empathize? And worse, how dare you shamelessly self-promote and write a poem about this now? And a bunch of press has come out in the last week, not about me or about my poem, but all sorts of people and writers wondering if this trend towards empathy has gone too far. I think that's fucked up. To erase that possibility, to erase the possibility of empathy, is to erase the act of making art. To imagine how another human being feels and to connect the dots is Shakespeare. It's fiction, romance, drama, horror, sci-fi. This is what you're doing. You're imagining yourself into an unimaginable place, and the format doesn't matter. You're just connecting the dots. So something really weird happened in the few days after that. Political extremists who hated my blog post started writing haikus and limericks in response. Some, I have to admit, were really well written. Some were really good parodies of my own poem, and some were more along the lines of roses are red, violets are blue, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. And my own readers started to write their own poems, and everyone all of a sudden was posting poetry in my blog comments. Then I found out that it was National Poetry Month. And my first thought, best thought, whatever, 10-minute poem got 250,000 views. And it was so embarrassing. Because if I'd known that 250,000 people were going to read what I'd written, I would have written something so much better. But if I'd written something so much better, I wouldn't have written it, if you get what I mean. It belonged to its moment. First thought, best thought, out, done. With the internet, you do not get to choose. When you open the door to your garret, or you walk out into the market, the bets are off. So how do you put your work out on the net and find an audience knowing how messy it can get, how fast, and how open to criticism it can leave you? A few days after this blew up, I posted a blog deconstructing my own poem, my own relatively bad poem, and talking about the ingredients that went into it, trying to explain what I had done. In other words, explaining the dots I'd been connecting. And a lot of people weighed into the conversation and talked about their own take on the poem. A lot of people liked it. A lot of people said, well, yeah, it's not your best work, but I didn't think it was weird. And a Boston Globe writer wrote an article called "The Problem with Amanda Palmer's Poem was that it was about Amanda Palmer." But that's true, of course. Because we can only write about what we see, and we can only connect the dots that we collect, which makes everything you write about you. What you write is you. What I write is me. My neighbors, my thoughts, my paranoias, the frightened conversations I overhear, what I read in the news, my childhood drama, my understanding of Shakespeare and Odysseus and the Wine Dark Sea and the Brady Bunch and Bukowski. My connections are what go into the stew, and that's all you ever have. So you can disguise it in any style, but it's still you. Kerouac said, "The only thing I had to offer was my own confusion." And that's enough. Your connections are the threads that you weave into the cloth that becomes the story that only you can tell. So back to the marketplace and the garret. In order for it to work, the door must remain unlocked. People might enter without knocking. They might crash your party and drink your wine. Let them in and let them drink, because you might meet somebody interesting. I wrote an email to that Boston Globe journalist the day after the article was published, since I knew him from around town. I had his address. And we talked over email, and I found out that he was just as shaken as I was by the events of the last week, that he had friends at the bomb site, and we connected, and it was okay. These are scary times, and when the world around you is in a moment of panic and chaos, and parents are hanging onto their kids, and people are falling to their knees, and people are gathered around screens in bars saying, "Oh my God." And the noises overhead are either threateningly loud or deafeningly silent, and the fingers start pointing in every direction, and some are shaking in fear, and some are stabbing in anger, and you may find yourself doing what you did as a child, saying, "Have you ever noticed this? Looks like this." And you may tie these ideas together with a metaphor of gauze, of a bandage, and people might shout, "This is not the time for metaphor. This is not the time for art, and this is certainly not the time for art about you." But once you've shared your art and it's resonated with a single person, it's no longer about you. Once you share it, it's about everybody. And if your art is found by a single soul, shared with a friend who links it to a friend, and the response is whatever it is, you start to see how art becomes about everybody, just through the act of being shared. And this is the way the internet is kind of beautiful. But you, as the writer, have to weather the critics. And you have to stay in the field. You have to still wake up and take up your pen and connect the dots, because they need connecting now so badly. We need people willing to wonder and risk the embarrassment of asking in the newspaper, in a book published by Penguin, on Tumblr, or in a tweet, "Have you ever noticed that this looks like this?" This is your job. And why would you want to do this and risk the pain and the evil of blog comments and YouTube comments? And if you're lucky, a bad review in the New York Times. Self-publishing without authentication and without that wand of legitimacy brushing your shoulder is truly scary. And there's self-publishing a book, which at least resembles something real, and then there is posting your shit to the internet. But I've found what resonates, resonates. Format doesn't matter. So are you willing, in this new era, where you might never get authentication from a publisher or a newspaper or something big and legitimate, are you willing to accept that a party in a garret with a bunch of groovy people helping you pay your rent and buy your ink and help keep your fridge stocked is enough? Because that's what it's coming to. When you go directly to the net and you publish something, it's your words, unfiltered, no fancy titles, no marketing campaign, no autotune, no blurbs, no praise, your voice to the world and there's nothing to hide behind. And had I jotted my poem down in my journal and typed it up a few weeks later and then decided a few years later to include it in an anthology of random Amanda Palmer writing, would it have gotten read? Probably. By some benevolent friends in my garret, probably. I'm not suggesting in the slightest that you forsake your painstakingly edited work and your protected, well-groomed, and agonized over treasures and post them to the internet tomorrow. That's not what I'm saying. But you can, if you want, if you're brave, you can yell down into the marketplace and find your friends and the crowd that will resonate with you without permission from on high. Because anything you change in any format, anything you write in any format, can change somebody, can change an opinion, can scratch an opening in a scarred up heart of a human being, and it doesn't matter how you do it. If your writing is good, if it resonates, if it connects the dots for anybody out there, the lovers will come, the haters will come, support will come, sometimes in the form of money, sometimes in the form of something less expected, and it balances. And no amount of criticism I've gotten in the past few weeks could defeat the experience I had 2 nights ago in San Francisco. On Thursday, I was at the Fillmore playing a tribute. It was awesome. Playing a tribute concert to this great songwriter, Robin Hitchcock. And Colin Malloy from the Decemberists was on stage singing one of Robin's songs. And I weaved my way into the crowd among the hundreds of people who were gathered there. And it was a perfect moment. A musician I respected playing songs I loved by a musician I respected, and all my friends together. And a woman with long gray hair in front of me turned around between 2 songs, and she grabbed my arm. And she said, "Thank you for writing a poem." And I thought, oh, fucking drama, it wasn't even a great poem. But the squeeze of her hand on my arm and the way she looked at me said, "Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Thank you for connecting the dots, for trying." So these are crazy times, and whether they ever aren't crazy times, I don't know. I doubt it. But I do know this is the time for metaphor, and this is the time for art, and this is the time for art about you, because you and me and them, we're all the same. We all feel pain, and if nobody else in the whole course of your life will say it to you, I will. Thank you for writing. Thank you for connecting the dots. Pick a format, any format, and I hope I get to see you all out there in the field.